So, as I was saying, this talk came about because someone asked me a question not too long ago about Cerridwen. How could people revere her when she did some sketchy stuff? And that in itself isn't an unusual question. It's one that comes up quite a bit in polytheist circles. How can a good god or goddess do a bad thing? Why would you honor a deity who did a bad thing? And these are important questions that deserve attention, even if they're a little hard to answer. Somehow this conversation blossomed recently to include questions about the contents of Cerridwen's cauldron. What is the awen stuff that was in it, and why was all but 3 drops of it poison? So I'll see whether I can shed some light on these things for you. While I've pondered these things myself, at times they haven't ever exactly troubled me. And from my own perspective, I think one reason that I'm not troubled may be because I ask slightly different questions than some people ask. So it'd be arrogant of me to say, like, oh, I'm asking the right questions and you're asking the wrong questions. It's not a case of that, but there's going to be quite a bit of opinion in this talk. You know, this is going to be the Sunday sermon, and maybe I can show you how asking some slightly different questions might yield more useful answers. So we'll see how that goes. So I'm going to just briefly tell the story. I'm pretty sure everybody knows it, but it's important to make sure of that. So Cerridwen was a noblewoman who had a very ugly son called Morvran. And although you can parse that word out to mean sea crow, Morvran is a word for cormorant. Not the prettiest, or to most people, the most noble or magical of birds. Morvran was so ugly that his nickname was Avagdi, utter darkness. And Cerridwen was naturally concerned about his social and career prospects. So she decided that if he could become a great bard, he might still get ahead in life. So Cerridwen decided to brew up a magical potion which would fill him with fabulous and intense bardic inspiration. She got a big cauldron and she gathered a bunch of herbs, and her potion needed to brew for a whole year and a day. So she got a blind man in to stoke the fire, and a lad called Gwion Bach, little Gwion, to stir the cauldron, because the cauldron had to be stirred pretty much constantly. So it was approaching the end of the year now, and Cerridwen was tired, and she sat down and she promptly fell asleep. Gwion was stirring away when a bubble rose in the cauldron, and 3 scalding hot drops of the potion flew out. Now, some versions of the story say the drops were headed for Avagdi, and Gwion pushed him out of the way and caught the drops. Others say, the drops just accidentally landed on Gwion's hand. Either way, he instinctively sucked on his hand to ease the burn, and flash, bang, wallop. Little Gwion was filled with enlightenment, and I don't just mean a slightly elevated mood. He knew everything. And he knew it all at the same time in layers that reached around the world, up into the sky and back into the past and down into Anuv, and everything was one, and he was one with it. And at the same time, he was transcending everything. And one of the things he knew was that Cerridwen had just awakened, and she was very angry and had murder in her heart. Now, while all this was happening in a split second in Gwion's mind, the cauldron itself split open with a crack. The hot liquid ran down the hill into a river, which it poisoned. And Gwyddno Garanhir's horses drank from that river, and they all died. But anyway, little Gwion was now anything and everything, and had become a very magical being. So he turned himself into a hare as his best chance of escaping from Cerridwen. And she became a greyhound and was hot on his heels when he jumped into the water and swam away as a salmon. And then Cerridwen chased after him in the form of an otter. So Gwion turned into a wee bird and then flew away, but Cerridwen became a hawk. And she nearly had him when he looked down and he saw a pile of wheat ready to be winnowed. So he became a grain of wheat and hid himself in that pile, thinking he might be safe. Cerridwen then turned herself into a black hen and began eating up all the grain until she swallowed him. She soon realized that she was pregnant and made a plan to kill the child when it was born. However, after she gave birth to the boy, she didn't have the heart to kill him. So she sewed him up in a skin bag and threw him into the water to take his chances. And he floated there for a long time and was eventually found in a salmon trap by Gwyn's son, a prince called Elfyn, who cut the bag open. And what he found in the bag was a boy with a shining brow, whom he called Taliesin, which means shining brow. The boy immediately began declaiming the most beautiful and perfectly constructed poetry. Elfin of the remarkable qualities, grieve not for your catch, though I am frail here in my bunting. There are wonders on my tongue. While I am watching over you, none can overcome you. And Taliesin went on to be the most revered bard in Welsh legend or history. So that's the story. Let's go back to Cerridwen and her cauldron of awen now. If the stuff in the cauldron was so great, why did it poison Gwyn's horses? That doesn't seem very fair. What a lousy way to run a myth. And no early text offers an explanation for this. So here are some questions that might be worth asking. Did this story really happen? Is it based on actual events, even if they might have been a little less magical and dramatic? Was Cerridwen an actual person who once lived? So the story is set in 6th century Gwynedd in North Wales. It mentions a king called Maelgwn, who's probably a historical reality. We can be almost certain that Maelgwn Gwynedd was a real king. It's possible that Gwyno and Elfyn were real people too, although that's a little less certain than Maelgwn. But by the time we get down to the details about Cerridwen and her family, well, there's no proof, but it's a long time ago, right? It could just be a story. I'm not telling you what to believe about this. More questions. Does this story have a purpose? Or to look at it another way, why would this story arise or persist in Welsh lore? So Taliesin was a 6th century bard, a historical person who probably originally also came from North Wales. He was the court bard for a time of King Gwion of Rheged. Now, Gwion was the greatest and best remembered king of the Old North, up there near the border with Scotland. There are many legends and poems about him which took root in Wales in later centuries. Taliesin is among the very first poets in Britain whose poetry survived long enough to be written down and preserved. Not only that, but he was and still is highly revered within Welsh bardic culture. So greatly revered that Welsh bards ever since have composed poetry in his voice or in his persona. And this practice had a particular flowering from maybe the 9th to the 13th centuries or thereabouts. The historical Taliesin, the real guy, wrote poems praising his patrons, primarily Irien, saying that they were great leaders, fearless in battle, generous to their people. Poems like this: leader supreme, most glorious king, far-famed shelter, the strongest of fighters. The English know him when his name's mentioned. Had death at his hands and many afflictions, their houses burning, their chattels stolen, with frequent losses and bitter distress. Lovely Erechwydd, most generous men, left Angles bereft, the most valiant king that was or will be. There's no competition. Watch him in battle, it's nothing but terror. Seen as a leader, he's full of good humor, surrounded by joy and abundant treasures. Gold, king of the north, supreme among kings. When I'm old, out of breath, commanded by death, I will feel delight, praising Irien aright. But these later poets, after the historical Taliesin's life, writing in Taliesin's voice, wrote long, complex, and obscure mystical poems in which they've often claimed to have known every form of existence and have all hidden knowledge. Poems like this: I was in a multitude of forms before I was unfettered. I was a slender, mottled sword made from the hand. I was a droplet in the air. I was the stellar radiance of the stars. Or this: I am fair in fame, songs are heard in the four-cornered fortress, strong door of the island, fresh water and jet are blended. Sparkling wine is their drink, set before the warbands. 3 shiploads of Cerridwen we went on the sea, save 7. None returned from the fort of rigidity. I set no value on paltry men, their shields trailing, who do not know who is created on which day, what hour at noon God was born, who made the one who did not go to the meadows of Devwi, who know nothing of the brindled ox with his stout collar, 70 links in its chain. So a magical backstory for the man these bards who wrote this kind of poetry saw as the founder of their lineage would certainly have suited them. And there's no doubt that bards at this time were what we might now kind of call influencers. So yes, I'm suggesting that this story didn't happen. I'm not, however, saying I don't believe it. So in a sense, my position is that I do believe it, but I'm not sure at which levels I believe it. So while I'm not entirely closed to the possibility of people transforming into animals and ladies getting pregnant by swallowing magical wheat, it's hard for me to believe. I would need a lot more evidence. What I do believe is that Taliesin was a poet of such extraordinary power and talent that Welsh culture was forever altered by his work, by his life, by his very existence on earth. Perhaps he revealed something to the bards who learned from him, which felt so holy and magical that a story like this was the only way they could make sense of it. If you study other stories from Ireland and Wales, you'll know that elements of this story crop up in other stories about power and bardic wisdom and so on. Now, while Welsh bards down through the centuries were busy channeling Taliesin or borrowing his persona, depending on how you look at it, they also mentioned Cerridwen in their poetry and aspects of this story we've just heard from time to time. It's obvious that they revere Cerridwen as a kind of muse more than a goddess. They sometimes call her Mam Awen, the mother of Awen. Awen, of course, is the stuff in the cauldron. But what is awen? It's a breath, a poetic inspiration, a wind, an active, living, sacred entity. It seems to be the thing that the bards desired above everything else, something which they saw as holy and perhaps only available to certain people if you read between the lines. Certainly, anyone who was able to tap into it dependably was both highly respected and considered blessed. To be a great bard was to be massively learned, deeply inspired, a close companion of kings and nobility with many special privileges. There's a tendency in the cynical modern age to see the bard-patron relationship as sycophantic, the bard as a greedy spin doctor. So we struggle, and it's no wonder, to conceive of leaders who were born into their privileged position as being worthy of the high praise which their bards offered them. What we forget, of course, is that the bard's praise also served as a roadmap, a guide to right behavior that hopefully held the nobility to fulfill their responsibilities of gathering wealth, distributing it to their people, and protecting their people. The power balance between the bards, the rulers, and later the church might be seen as analogous to our branches of government today in some ways, to the different legislative houses and law courts and so on, which are supposed to be checks and balances on power. We know that the relationship between some rulers and their bards was congenial, even intimate. They were closest of friends. I think when it was at its best, it sometimes almost had a sacramental type nature, that relationship in which bardic praise helped to perpetuate a sense of willing duty in leaders. So I know that was a bit of a digression, maybe, and not quite my usual ready-made lecture on what is awen, which is on the YouTube channel if you want to see it. But perhaps it might help you understand the milieu in which the tale of Cerridwen and Taliesin grew up as a kind of creation story for the bards. I'm not saying it's just propaganda. Its roots are deep, deep in Welsh culture. And there is much, I think, a way of expressing the truth as explaining the phenomenon of Taliesin. I know we need to get back and pick up some threads. One is the poison attribute of the contents of the cauldron. So there isn't necessarily one correct interpretation of that episode, but I think it's at least reminding us that not every being or every person will necessarily be helped, and indeed may be damaged by a strong dose of sudden enlightenment, or by the dregs of somebody else's leftover awen. Or put another way, that particular dose of enlightenment and inspiration had Gwion's name on it and was only a good fit for him. And remember, this is me interpreting the story. He had spent an entire year closely involved in its creation. Gwion had, even if he was only the servant of Cerridwen, not the mastermind of her plan. So in the somewhat similar tale of Finn and the salmon of knowledge, Finn is cooking the sacred salmon for his teacher, and some juice burns his thumb. Like Gwion, he sucks on the burn. When his master, Finneagus, realizes what had happened, he knows that the salmon wasn't intended for him. and tells Fionn to eat the whole fish himself. He doesn't say, oh, it's filled with knowledge, let's split it. It's that fish, the salmon of knowledge is for Fionn. Some versions of the tale of Cerridwen and Gwion tell us that Gwion was a yeoman's son. So he's not a poor, scruffy wretch. And perhaps his servitude could also be seen as a fosterage or apprenticeship. These are just ideas I've been thinking about lately. I'm not saying that a random scruffy wretch would have been less worthy of receiving awen, but he might have been less well prepared. So bards were trained from a young age in the craft of writing poetry. And they spent many years memorizing stories and older poetry, as well as memorizing boring things like laws and genealogies. The method of memorization was hours of rote recitation. That was how they spent the latter parts of their childhood and youth. This no doubt contributed to a calm and, ordered mind, well under the control of its owner. Imagine Tibetan monks chanting their daily mantra. Should some genuine awen then blow into a mind like that, then the awen wouldn't be wasted and it wouldn't do damage. If you'd like to delve a little deeper into the topics in my videos, you might enjoy taking one of my online classes. You can find out more about them at the link which is on your screen now. You can also support my work on Ko-fi or by becoming a patron. You'll also find free content to read on my Patreon page and on my website. All the links are in the description. Now, what about Cerridwen's behavior? I think this is open to interpretation, of course. And because motherhood can be an emotive subject for some of us, it sometimes evokes strong responses in people. First, we might say, oh, here's a woman desperately trying to help her disadvantaged son. So she becomes a heroine, a model mother. Then, especially if we go with the most popular version of the tale, that Gwion got the awen accidentally, she becomes a killer, someone intent on killing a child. Oh no. And worse yet, infanticide. She plans infanticide. Oh, but then she can't do it. So maybe that redeems her a bit. But it still seems pretty heartless, setting a child afloat in a skin bag. So, is Cerridwen a caring mother goddess that loving mothers should identify with? Or is she a wise and ruthless witch, simply bent on achieving her intentions? Honestly, I think these are the wrong questions. It doesn't work well to approach myth in the way we approach modern fiction, where we're encouraged to identify with one or more characters. The mother, the hero, the lover, whoever. With myth, there's a point, where we need to back away and look at the big picture. The Welsh bards don't seem to have revered Cerridwen as a goddess. Or if they did, possibly only at some point in the pre-Christian past, where we have no records, when they may not have even used the name Cerridwen for her yet. Now, this isn't to say that they didn't revere her as some kind of ancient sacred force. A force you might describe as a muse, someone who provides inspiration. But it seems to go deeper than that. They called her Mam Awen, the mother of awen. There's even a poem in her voice in the book of Taliesin called Cerridwen's Chair or Cerridwen's Seat, in the sense of a bardic chair or seat of honor. There are a few poems like that in the book of Taliesin that are some famous character's chair in which the bard takes on the persona of the character in question. So this is just a little snippet. When the chairs come to be judged, in other words, when the quality of the bards come to be judged, my own will be the best of them, my song and my cauldron and my rules, and my careful declamation worthy of a chair. I am called a knowledgeable one in Don's court, I and Eronwy and Aaron. So in other parts of this poem, Cerridwen is placed in the court of Don, perhaps even as sister to Gwion and Aranrod. Members of the children of Don seem to stem from earlier Celtic deities. Some of them are obvious cognates for Irish deities or Roman-era Celtic deities. So maybe Cerridwen was a goddess, although she didn't make it into the four branches of the Mabinogi as they've come down to us. Many people would argue, of course, that since she's worshipped and treated as a goddess now, then she is now a goddess. And I've never been too sure about that concept of apotheosis, where great or legendary persons are elevated to the status of gods. A lot of people believe in that, and they could be right. I think I believe something more like gods and goddesses are eternal beings, and they appear in a particular place or time because the people in that place or time notice them, or they reveal themselves to those people. I'm not sure whether that's any more logical than apotheosis, but it makes sense to me. Perhaps Cerridwen has always been a goddess, but in the time of the early Welsh bards, they kind of lacked a vocabulary for that. The medieval Welsh don't talk about gods in their literature at all, except for the Christian one. And bards often express both the idea that awen comes from the Christian god and that it comes from Cerridwen or her cauldron, sometimes practically in the same breath. So what does happen, though, is that as Welsh folk culture progresses toward the modern era, Cerridwen becomes slightly more of the classic storybook witch figure. I mean, we can see that even in the stories like the one I told, that's beginning to take shape. Storytellers begin to emphasize her frightening and child-threatening aspects. Magic itself is reduced to the dark art of witchcraft, and cauldrons lose their mystical, mythological meanings in favor of being just a tool of the witch's trade. Then the intentional rehabilitation of the idea of witches, by 20th century feminists and pagans had another effect. While it sometimes insisted that witches were all just misunderstood and persecuted healers and midwives, there was also a popular strand, which you can see very clearly now, which dragged a lot of witch tropes, a lot of stereotyping about witches into the neo-pagan consciousness. Suddenly it's cool to wear a pointy hat and put weird ingredients into a cauldron and live in a cobweb-infested hut. And I think some of that has clung to Cerridwen in a way that also obscures the Cerridwen that the Welsh bards honored so greatly. Equally, I think the popular cult of goddess religion and ideas about a great mother goddess have been applied to Cerridwen in ways that overlook her function in Welsh culture. People think they're reclaiming something which in effect maybe doesn't belong to them. Here the emphasis is on Cerridwen, the mother, who tries so hard to help her disadvantaged son, who can't bear to kill the child who is trespassing in her womb. Motherhood is a touching theme, but Cerridwen is the mother of awen, first and foremost. She has a clear function in Welsh bardic culture, and that function is to supply awen to the Welsh bards. And they still exist, by the way. Poetry's still a big deal in Wales, even today. Poetry that's filled with a deep love of language and learning and appreciation of the skilled and precise use of language, not just a bit of rambling self-expression. So the magical explosion that happens when the well-prepared mind meets the transcendence that is awen is what the Welsh bardic tradition is all about. The final strand of this talk is still the question of good gods doing dodgy things. And here I think I have to lead a little bit on that old 4th century pagan philosopher Sallustius. To wish to teach the whole truth about the gods to all produces contempt in the foolish, because they cannot understand, and a lack of zeal in the good. Whereas to conceal the truth by myths prevents the contempt of the foolish and compels the good to practice philosophy. Oh, that's a mouthful. What does he mean? To conceal the truth by myths compels us to practice philosophy. If things could be stated in plain, simple terms, first, we might not value them. When truth is enfolded in myth or bardic poetry, we're forced to consider things much more deeply. We're forced to practice philosophy, as he calls it. And this, to me, is part of the miracle of myth and one of its aspects, which allows it to remain relevant. The easy interpretation, the surface reading, the idea that there will be a simple moral to the story that everyone can agree on. It's not the way of myth. And yet I'm always telling you, read the myths so you can know the gods, right? And this is where I have to say something mystical, like the gods are in the myths, but the myths are not factual accounts of the lives of the gods. The myths are much more like plays in which the gods play roles which do reveal aspects of themselves, but which require you to practice philosophy to understand. And understand is a verb, not a destination.